At 11:49 p.m. on August 19, 2026, New York trading floors were holding their breath. $20 billion in Canadian exports were 60 minutes away from a 50% tariff wall. And then silence came. Not from Ottawa, but from Washington itself. Donald Trump posted on Truth Social at 11:51 p.m. Eastern Time. The 50% tariffs on Canadian goods were paused indefinitely. And the financial world immediately started asking one question: why? If you want to understand modern trade power, watch this moment carefully, because what happened in those final 90 minutes was not luck. It was the result of one country knowing exactly what it holds. Canada supplies 63.4% of all crude oil America imports. That number comes directly from the Canada Energy Regulator's May 2026 report. Not 30%, not half. 63.4% of U.S. crude imports. Every morning, American refineries in the Midwest wake up running on Canadian oil. Wood River, Illinois, Whiting, Indiana, Detroit, Michigan. All Canadian crude dependent. A 10% tariff on that oil alone would cost American consumers $3 to $5 per barrel. But oil was only one card Canada was holding. Canada also controls approximately 40% of Northeastern US electricity supply. Hydro-Québec alone exports billions of kilowatt-hours annually into New York and New England. These are not optional imports. You cannot replace Hydro-Québec output overnight. There is no switch America flips to make the power appear from nowhere. Then there is uranium. Canada is the world's second-largest uranium producer. Saskatchewan's Athabasca Basin holds some of the highest-grade uranium deposits on Earth. American nuclear plants, which generate 18% of U.S. electricity, depend on that supply, and potash, the fertilizer mineral that feeds American agriculture. Canada controls roughly 35% of the world's total potash reserves. Saskatchewan alone holds enough potash to fertilize global crops for centuries. Now add critical minerals, lithium, graphite, nickel, cobalt, copper, rare earths. Washington's own negotiators were at the table demanding preferential access to these resources because they need them immediately. Electric vehicle batteries, semiconductors, defense systems, radar, data center infrastructure all require these minerals. Canada holds significant deposits of nearly every single one of those materials. These are the cards that were sitting on the Canadian side of the table. Mark Carney did not walk into those final negotiations desperate or defensive. He walked in knowing precisely what leverage geography and geology had given Canada. And the three words he had repeated for months became the strategic anchor of everything. Canada will not accept a bad deal. He said it first publicly in August 2025 at a premier's meeting in Charlottetown. He repeated it to every journalist, every province, every trade partner who asked. He said it directly to Trump in phone calls leading up to the August deadline. That position held across every negotiating session in Washington throughout the summer of 2026. Canadian Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Chief Negotiator Janice Charette spent days in Washington. They stayed through weekends. They cancelled flights. But they never moved the line Carney had drawn publicly and repeatedly. And here is where the finance expertise matters. Markets price in capitulation faster than they price in strength. Canada's negotiating posture communicated something crucial to global financial markets. This was not a country begging for relief from a more powerful partner. This was a resource superpower methodically negotiating the terms of a relationship it understood better than Washington did. The Canadian dollar held relatively stable through the tariff crisis months. Markets believed Canada had real cards to play. Less than 2 hours before the tariff clock expired, the signal proved correct. Trump announced the delay. LeBlanc and Greer walked out together to speak to reporters. Carney posted on social media calling it significant progress. Policy magazine described the emerging deal as far more than a tariff settlement. It called it a potential framework touching critical minerals, China policy, investment screening, and digital trade. That is the architecture of a relationship between equals, not a surrender document. The question every serious financial analyst was asking by August 20th was simple. How did Canada, an economy roughly 1/10 the size of America's, engineer this outcome? The answer starts with a number most Americans have never heard cited correctly: $900 billion. That is the total annual value of Canada-US trade according to figures cited by Benzinga and Bloomberg in August 2026. $900 billion in annual cross-border commerce built on integrated supply chains. You do not tariff your oxygen supplier and expect to breathe more freely. That is the economic reality Trump's own advisors understood even when the political rhetoric suggested otherwise. At $900 billion annually, this trade relationship had no clean exit for either side. But Washington had spent 18 months pretending that number was negotiable. It was not. It never was. And August 19th proved it definitively. Consider what Washington explicitly excluded from the tariff list entirely. Energy, potash, seafood, certain critical minerals, all exempted before the tariffs were even announced. You do not exclude something from a tariff list unless taxing it hurts you more than them. Energy excluded because 63% of American crude imports cannot carry a 50% surcharge. Potash excluded because American farmers plant their corn and soybeans using Canadian fertilizer every spring. Critical minerals excluded because Washington is simultaneously begging Ottawa for preferential access to those same resources. The tariff list that looked aggressive was architecturally designed around Canada's strongest cards. That architecture told every serious economist exactly where the real leverage resided, and Mark Carney's negotiating team had mapped every single one of those exclusions months in advance. Canadian trade negotiator Janice Charette did not arrive in Washington improvising strategy on a whiteboard. She arrived with a precise understanding of which American industries would scream loudest under tariff pressure. American distillers screamed loudest and earliest in this trade confrontation. Canada's provincial liquor boards had quietly removed American spirits from their shelves months earlier. The result was catastrophic for U.S. distillers. Exports of American spirits to Canada dropped over 70%. Those distillers did not call Ottawa to complain. They called Washington. They called their senators. They called their trade associations. They called the White House directly. That internal American pressure, industry against its own government, is Canada's most underappreciated trade weapon. When Canadian provinces stop buying Kentucky bourbon, Kentucky senators notice immediately. When Canadian lumber tariffs raise the cost of American homebuilding, homebuilders lobby Congress aggressively. Canada does not need to threaten America publicly when American industries do the threatening internally. American auto parts manufacturers were openly warning their congressional representatives about supply chain disruption. Ontario and Michigan share one of the most integrated auto manufacturing corridors in the world. A single vehicle crossing the US-Canada border multiple times during production is standard. Tariff that production corridor and you halt assembly lines. Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis all have manufacturing exposure on both sides of that border. Their lobbyists were in Washington making the economic case that Canada's side could not hear themselves. Carney understood this mechanism deeply from his years as governor of the Bank of Canada and his time leading the Bank of England through Brexit trade disruptions. A man who navigated the United Kingdom's most complex economic restructuring in modern history understands leverage precisely. He did not need to bang tables in Washington. He needed to hold a clear position publicly. Canada will not accept a bad deal was a signal to American industries that the pressure would continue until Washington moved, and Washington moved. 90 minutes before the deadline, Washington moved. The CUSMA framework, worth $900 billion in annual integrated trade, was proof of that need. Canada and the United States had grown their bilateral trade by 27% since CUSMA's 2020 launch. That is $275 billion in additional trade created by one agreement over 6 years. You do not walk away from $275 billion in created value without catastrophic consequence. Washington knew that, Ottawa knew that, and both sides knew the other side knew it. but only one side had a leader publicly committed to holding a non-negotiable line throughout. Carney's 3 words, "no bad deal," functioned as a credibility anchor for every Canadian negotiator in the room. LeBlanc could not make a concession that contradicted the Prime Minister's public position without political collapse. That structural constraint actually strengthened Canada's negotiating position rather than weakening it. When a negotiator genuinely cannot say yes to a bad offer, the other side must improve the offer. This is basic game theory applied to sovereign trade negotiations at the highest possible stakes. Now look at what the emerging deal framework represented for Canada's long-term economic positioning. Policy magazine described it as potentially encompassing critical minerals, China policy, and digital trade alignment. Each of those elements carries decade-scale economic implications far beyond any single tariff negotiation. Critical minerals access means Washington is acknowledging Canada as a strategic resource partner, not just a neighbor. That acknowledgement has real dollar value in terms of investment flows, infrastructure development, and processing capacity. Canada's critical minerals are not infinite. Granting preferential access is a sovereign decision with consequences that extend well past any one administration. Carney understood this explicitly, which is why he rejected the framing of minerals as simple negotiating leverage. "It's looking at whether it's in our mutual interest to trade more," he said publicly in May 2026. China policy alignment was the other major element embedded inside this emerging bilateral framework. Washington's Section 301 investigations, launched in March 2026, targeted 60 countries for structural excess capacity. Canada had already resolved its own bilateral trade dispute with Beijing by January 2026. That resolution gave Canada something Washington currently lacked: an open diplomatic and trade channel with China. America needs partners who can navigate both relationships simultaneously without ideological rigidity blocking economic reality. Canada demonstrated exactly that capability throughout the trade tensions of 2025 and 2026. Alberta exported over $152 billion worth of goods to the United States in 2025. Energy products alone accounted for $125.2 billion of the total annual export figure. Those numbers made Alberta's oil indispensable to American refining, regardless of any political disagreement between capitals. Saskatchewan's potash dominance, 35% of global reserves, made Canadian fertilizer indispensable to American agriculture permanently. Quebec's aluminum and hydroelectric capacity made Canadian industrial inputs indispensable to American manufacturing across multiple sectors simultaneously. These were not negotiating chips. These were structural economic facts baked into North American industrial civilization itself. And on August 19, 2026, those structural facts finally overwhelmed Washington's political tariff ambitions completely. Canada is indispensable to American energy security, food security, mineral security, and electricity grid stability simultaneously. That simultaneous indispensability across 4 critical sectors is what made Carney's 3 words credible rather than merely defiant. Without the oil, the potash, the uranium, and the critical minerals, those words were just words. With them, those words were the most expensive 3 words in modern North American economic history. $20 billion paused, $900 billion stabilized. A framework for decades of strategic partnership begun. All because one leader knew exactly what his country held and refused to pretend otherwise at the table. That is not luck. That is not diplomacy. That is financial strategy executed at sovereign scale with precision. If you have watched this far, you already think differently about trade power than most people around you. Hit subscribe on Market Mindset right now. This is exactly the analysis you will not find anywhere else.